So we've got a major new development in a critical election/redistricting fight, and this case is now rapidly turning into one of the biggest election law battles that's currently happening in the country. This is all happening after the Supreme Court issued a major 6-3 ruling and then also a remand order in another case coming out of Alabama dealing with their congressional map case. That ruling and that remand immediately triggered emergency litigation, emergency briefing, and last Friday, emergency oral arguments officially happening in federal courts, and now we're going to see the impact of what just happened. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button. That just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always trying to expand upon their benefits to give you as much as possible as a member. And right now, for a limited time, if you decide to sign up and you use my code ARMEDSCHOLAR, you can get $50 off the individual sign-up fee or $25 off the family sign-up fee. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we have a critical update and some news going on right now revolving around the Alabama election lawsuit and challenge that was recently remanded by the Supreme Court, and now emergency oral arguments and litigation is developing in a federal district court. Now, first, we need to understand what the Supreme Court actually did in that recent order, because that is what is currently impacting what is going on in this Alabama challenge. Now, in the recent review of the Alabama case, the Supreme Court did not outright reverse the Alabama District Court. Instead, the Supreme Court vacated and remanded the case back down to the lower court for further consideration in light of the Supreme Court's new 6-3 ruling in the Louisiana versus Calais case. That distinction matters because this was not the Supreme Court saying that Alabama automatically wins this case. Instead, the Supreme Court essentially told the lower court, go back and reconsider portions of your prior ruling under the new framework that we announced in that Louisiana case. And specifically, the Supreme Court appears focused on the Voting Rights Act Section 2 analysis that was performed by the lower court. Now, if you remember, the lower federal court in this case had previously ruled that Alabama's 2023 congressional map still unlawfully diluted black voting strength and violated federal laws. The court-ordered map created a second district which significantly increased Democrat competitiveness in Alabama. So politically, this case has massive implications for both Republicans and Democrats in the state of Alabama. But now, after the Supreme Court remanded the case, Alabama immediately asked to restore its original 2023 legislative enacted map again, which would give them more strength in the state. And that is where this entire situation has now exploded into emergency litigation because, of course, Democrats in Alabama want to oppose that. Now, here's where things are becoming interesting in this case. The plaintiffs, which are kind of the Democrat supporters, immediately rushed back into federal court and filed emergency motions asking for the district court to keep the current remedial map in place. The plaintiffs argued that the remedial map is now the actual status quo, not Alabama's old 2023 map. Their argument in support of keeping the remedial map in place is that Alabama has already begun actually using the remedial map, that they've been using that candidates already campaigned under that map, that election officials already prepared for elections under that map. And because of that, they argue that suddenly changing the congressional map going to the 2023 style would create complete election chaos and confusion for voters. Now, in response to that, Alabama and the Republican supporters, of course, responded to those arguments, and the state is arguing that the Supreme Court's new ruling in the Louisiana versus Calais case completely changed the legal framework governing these Voting Rights Act claims. According to Alabama, the lower court cannot simply reuse its old rulings because the Supreme Court significantly updated the legal standards that now should apply. The state is specifically arguing that the remedial map improperly relied on race when drawing congressional districts, which Alabama argues now violates the Supreme Court's new framework. The state says that the prior remedial map elevated race too heavily in the districting process, and that the court must now reconsider whether race became the predominant factor in drawing those districts in the remedial map. Alabama is also arguing that the original 2023 congressional map was based on partisan political goals, not racial discrimination. The state essentially told the court that Republicans should not be penalized for trying to protect GOP voting strength in a heavily Republican state. And now we have officially reached the next major phase of this fight. Again, this is kind of happening all fast on an emergency basis because the election is looming. And last Friday, there were emergency oral arguments that officially happened in the Northern District of Alabama. So this happened in front of a federal court. And honestly, some of the biggest developments may have come from the judges themselves and based on some of the questions and concerns they raised. During the hearing, multiple judges appeared openly skeptical of Alabama's arguments. At several points, the judges actually questioned how Alabama could now challenge factual findings that this same federal court previously made back in 2023 when it found that the state's legislative map likely violated the Voting Rights Act. The judges also pushed back on Alabama's reliance on the Supreme Court's Purcell principle. Now, if you're unfamiliar with that doctrine, generally it just warns that federal courts essentially should not be making major election changes too close to an election because of the risk of voter confusion. But one of the judges raised a major issue with Alabama's arguments that they were arguing in favor of why they needed to go to the 2023 map. The judge essentially questioned whether that doctrine even helps Alabama here because the court would not be injecting a brand new map into the process. Instead, the current remedial map is already the map that Alabama has been using, so they're arguing that that doctrine does not help Alabama. And that became one of the major issues during the oral arguments on Friday. One judge directly asked Alabama how using the state's 2023 map, which voters have not actually been using, would somehow be less confusing than simply keeping the remedial map that it's already being used and was used in 2024, and also was used, I believe, in last week's primary elections. And again, that's a major warning sign for Alabama and their arguments. And perhaps the biggest moment for Friday's hearing came from one of the judges. The judge directly asked the state of Alabama, if the Supreme Court wanted the state to be able to do this here, wouldn't it have simply stayed the injunction that they issued, not vacate and send the case back down for reconsideration? What the judge is essentially asking Alabama is if the Supreme Court truly wanted Alabama's 2023 map immediately restored, why didn't it simply say so and do so outright? Instead, the judge here is arguing the Supreme Court vacated and remanded the case back to the same lower court for additional review, and therefore they can do whatever they want. Now, another major issue that was a focus of Friday's arguments during those emergency oral arguments was essentially the election, administration chaos. Alabama and the Secretary of the state's Director of Elections testified during the hearing and explained just how compressed the timeline now is with the looming election. According to the testimony there, the counties would only have about 7 days starting from May 27th to reassign voters into new congressional districts under Alabama's 2023 map if the court allows the state to move forward with that map. And the judges seem concerned about that because that is an incredibly short timeline. But interestingly, election officials also testified that voters over the last 10 days have already been told by Alabama that they would be moving to the new map in August, meaning that reversing course once again by going back on what they just told them over the last 10 days would also create additional confusion. So both sides, both Alabama and the other side, are arguing that this ruling, if it goes against them, would be complete chaos, would cause so much confusion, and that's why the court should rule in their favor. So this is now getting very interesting, and we're going to have to watch closely during this week to see how the court rules on this, because again, this is going to develop fast, especially with the looming election, and based on some of the testimony of some of the election officials in Alabama, they're saying that if this happens, it needs to happen as fast as possible. Now, one final thing that's important to also understand and that I want to note is that this case matters much more, and far beyond just this election law issue in Alabama. Congressional redistricting directly impacts the makeup and control of the House of Representatives, and ultimately that also affects everything from federal legislation, committee leadership, oversight of agencies like the ATF and DOJ. It impacts judicial confirmation, so what judges are going to serve on the federal courts, and also a lot of other broader constitutional issues and litigation involving a lot of things that we talk about here on the channel, like the Second Amendment. So while this case is fundamentally about elections and constitutional procedure, the downstream effects absolutely impacts other policies and other things that we talk about here on the channel, including firearms policies. So that's the latest major update in this Alabama election/redistricting battle. Following those Friday emergency oral arguments that happened in the federal court, We will likely get a ruling probably fairly fast on this, so we're going to have to watch closely this week to see how this develops. And as more develops, as we get more information, potentially as we get that ruling, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And don't forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.